We're looking back at the British Grand Prix from 2015 in this episode of the PETRONAS Retro Race Review, and there's lots to discuss. The Williams drivers getting the jump on Lewis and Nico at the start of the race, the strategy tactics that put Lewis into the lead, and that call of when to switch to the intermediate tyres as the rain started to fall at Silverstone. Shov, when you think back to that race weekend, what comes to mind?
The British Grand Prix is always such a special weekend. It's one of the home races for the team. We're very close to the factory, so we've got a lot of the staff from Brackley and Brixworth there. It's also a big race for Lewis, and there's so many people that are there to see him. So when you go there with a car that you know is quick enough to be on pole, you know it's quick enough to win the race, there's a lot of pressure, but there's also a lot of excitement. So it's always got that buzz.
You mentioned it being Lewis's home race, and we've got a question in from Glenn on Twitter asking just how motivated Lewis is in front of his home fans, and do you notice a different mindset from him that weekend?
You do, and it's very difficult when drivers go to their home races because there's always pressure on them. When you get a home Grand Prix, there's even more pressure. They desperately want to do well in front of all the fans who've paid to go there and to see them. And as we said before, at Silverstone, there's a huge number of people who turn up hoping to see a driver like Lewis do well. With most drivers, that pressure's probably a bit of a distraction for a lot of the weekend, especially when you get sessions like qualifying that are difficult enough for the drivers anyway. There's a huge amount of expectation on them anyway going into quali. From what I've seen, Lewis handles that really well. Now, no doubt he will tell you it is difficult. It does add to the burdens of the weekend. There's more work for them to do because there's a lot of marketing work in and around the home Grand Prix that's in addition to their normal workload. But Lewis does seem to feed off that, and certainly on a Sunday, he'll tell you that it's not often you can hear the crowd when you're in your car. You've got your crash helmet on, your earplugs in. But Silverstone is one of those places that, when he overtakes a car, he can hear the cheering in the crowd, and it does give him a lot of energy.
So let's talk about the race then and the start of the race. It didn't go to plan for your two drivers. We've got a question in from Turk8044 on Twitter saying, why the bad start? What was the reason?
This is a few years ago, and the way the clutches work was quite different back then. So we used to be able to use two paddles when the drivers did a start. So one would hold the clutch fully released, and you could use the other hand in a position where the drivers were trying to get it where it was just right for the bite point. But the other problem was because you were trying to control the clutch on position alone, the temperature of that carbon material in the clutch had a big effect on how much torque was transferred. So we had to warm the clutches before the start. So as our cars would get to the grid, there would be a sort of clutch warming procedure where the drivers would load it up, they'd slip it to try and get some temperature into it, ready for the start. Now, that day in Silverstone, we'd estimated how long it would take the grid to form, but the grid formed much quicker than we'd expected. So both our cars had hot clutches, and that meant that the torque transfer when they released was different to what we expected. Now, the actual problem on both cars was subtly different. In Nico's case, the hot clutch led to fade, so he didn't get enough torque, he wasn't slipping the wheels, and he didn't take advantage of the grip that was available. Whereas in Lewis's case, the result was that we ended up with more torque than we expected. The start started okay, but then roughly a second into it, we ended up with more torque. That caused wheel spin, and then he lost performance as a result. So both cars had a bad start. Was it expected? No, we were always hoping for better than that, but they did happen from time to time. And what the rule makers have done since is changed it to torque control, so that the drivers are now more in charge of the important bit, but they can only use one hand for the start now. So rather than being the engineers heavily involved in trying to teach them how to get the right torque, it's now down to the drivers to deliver it correctly.
So what happens when a start happens like that? We've had another question in on Instagram from Somali saying, had you accounted for a poor start and the possibility of starting in third and fourth? What do you do with your strategy models at that point?
We don't normally have to account for a bad start because normally our starts are good. However, you do need to account for the fact that you might not be on pole or you might not have locked out the front row. Sometimes when we have a very long run to turn one, so this would be circuits like Monza, like Sochi, like Spa as well, where it's not so much turn one but the run down to turn five after Eau Rouge. Those are all circuits where even if you start in pole, it's very, very easy to lose a position. And in those races, we're looking for a strategy that's resilient to position loss at the start. So that might be which tyre you start on. A harder tyre would normally give you more scope to position. We're also thinking through the weekend about how we set the car up. So making sure we've got a good race car, and the race engineers and the drivers, with the way they tune the car over the weekend, can bias it towards qualifying pace, they can bias it towards race pace. But if you've got a good race car, you've always got good opportunity to recover. So the short answer is no, we don't really plan for it, but what we do is we try and make ourselves resilient to being behind in terms of strategy.
Let's move through the race now and to the first pit stops. We've had a question in on Twitter from Ross H asking about Lewis's in-lap and how important that was for your strategy while you were performing the undercut to beat Massa. How well did Lewis do there?
Well, because we were doing an undercut, it's not actually the in-lap that's very important. And at Silverstone, you peel off for the pits going into turn 16. All you've got's a right-hander braking for the limiter line and then into your box. So there isn't really a lot of time to be made there. What was very important that day was a good pit stop. And as it happens, we were about 1 second quicker than the Williams. So that was very useful time that he was able to gain over both of those Williams cars. But the other thing was the outlap. The outlap was quite incredible. He was on the hard tyre. He was actually able to take about 3 seconds out of Massa on that outlap, and that was what allowed him to jump 2 cars in one go. Just that 3 seconds in the outlap plus the 1 second in the pit stop. And when he started that sequence only about 1.3 seconds behind Massa, obviously you end up in front if you can find that much time.
When you were planning to bring Lewis in, what were you waiting for? Did you think the Williams team might bring their drivers in? There
was certainly a risk that Williams would, because when you've got faster cars behind you, you've always got to be very wary of that undercut. And that's when we'd use a box avoid scenario, which is to say if they do it, we don't come in. So that's one factor, but there's 2 things you're really waiting for. One is for the traffic to clear out of your window. You don't want to come in trying to undercut but then get stuck behind a midfield car. And the other one is you've got to make sure you can get your tyres to the end. And that's the bit that you never know for sure on what lap you can actually achieve that. So the real reason that Williams wouldn't have come in much sooner would have been that question of tyre life. We had a faster car. We knew that we could probably convert some of that speed to additional tyre management. But when you're stuck behind, you've got to be brave and you've got to take a bit of a risk on those tyre lives. But obviously that window did allow us to make that undercut work. And that's basically what this race planner shows. You can see that the cars are very bunched up. So both Williams were right behind one another. And that meant that Lewis was within range of actually getting both of them, which is quite unusual. But with that really good outlap, the good pit stop, as we talked about, he was able to make that jump with a 2-car undercut, which is quite impressive.
You can't talk about a British Grand Prix without mentioning the good old British weather. And we've had a question in on Instagram from Craig Austin saying, did you have any rain spotters around Silverstone to tell you when the rain's coming in? We know we always see you guys on the pit wall lean back and see if the rain is coming down, but do you have extra people out there?
The big thing that we have at Silverstone is an awful lot of people who live near our factory. And the factory, as you know, is only 10 minutes down the road from the racetrack. So when we know which direction the weather's coming from, we can find people who live in the vicinity, 5 miles out, 10 miles out, 15 miles out. It gives us a very accurate picture of when the rain is coming in. It also gives us a good idea of the intensity and also when it stops. So we know how long those showers might be. Silverstone's actually the only place that we do that. But to be honest, there's more than one Grand Prix where we've had to rely on people looking out the window or being in the garden, feeding information directly to us on the pit wall, describing what the weather's doing.
When we got to the point when the rain did start falling, there was the challenge of knowing when to bring Lewis and Nico in and when to put on the intermediate tyres. Sam on Instagram has asked, how did you make that decision to bring Lewis in? Was it his idea? Was it the team's idea? Or is it a mixture of both at that point?
Well, we obviously knew there was a chance that we might need to go to inters, but what you're worried about when you're in the lead of a race is that you jump to inters and actually you can stick on the dries or the rain stops and suddenly you've got to make 2 pit stops. You've got to get back onto the dry tyres and you've thrown away the result. So we could see the situation unfolding. You just don't know how much rain there's going to be. Now, in this instance, it was Lewis who made the call. The drivers have got a very good feel for the grip level, obviously, in the car. When you start to get rain, you can still run. If you've got good rubber on the tyres, they can generate temperature. But when you get more rain, and if your tyres are quite worn, as they were in Lewis's case, that temperature can drop. And then suddenly you get a big reduction in the grip level. And the risk there is not just that you're slow, it's that the driver will spin off, he'll end up in the gravel. So the drivers, we do let make that decision. Lewis called to say that he had to come in to take the intermediate tyres. We're obviously ready because we could see the situation unfolding. But you're right, on this occasion it was him making that decision.
Following on from that, we've had another question in on Instagram from Enes saying that in wet conditions, do you suggest strategies to drivers or do you wait for their calls? Because you've got a lot of data there. Surely you should be the one telling them what to do, no?
Well, I mean, often it is. I think the key with a wet race is the communication is everything. And, you know, we've had races where we've had great communication between the pit wall and the drivers and it's led to us making decisions where we've won. Equally, we've had days where we've got it wrong and we look back at it and we always pick out key instances where if we'd given them a bit better information or if they'd given us more information about how the tyres were feeling, we could have done a better job of it. So it's a team effort, as it always is. What you do know, though, when it's transitioning to dry, is that we can actually sort of see who's trying slick tyres, how much quicker are they going. We're watching those sector times. As soon as you see a guy on dry tyres go purple, you know it's time to switch. Probably it's even a little bit late by that stage. But it is just this case of we're giving the drivers the information that we know. They're giving us the information that they know, what they can see, what they can feel. And hopefully, if you get all that together, you'll make some good decisions on the day.
Well, you made all the right decisions in Silverstone back in 2015, Shov. And just talking about a home Grand Prix from your point of view, how does that work from a scheduling point of view? Is it very different to being away on the road at a race?
I mean, it is, because those of us that live near the factory, which is actually the majority of the race team, we all stay at home. So you get quite an unusual mix of sort of family life and managing to get home for dinner with your family, but then getting up and going into work at the track. So it's quite a special feeling. It's probably more difficult to balance all of those needs. It is a great race, and it's one of those crowds that's, you know, probably in the top 3 crowds around the whole world for, you know, just how much they get into the Grand Prix and how much they are there behind the teams. And it's so good spirited as well at Silverstone. You know, there's everyone's there just because they love the sport. They've all got their favourite drivers, but it's a great race, and hopefully we can get back there this year. Whether or not that will be with crowds, we'll need to see. But it is a great event, and one that we do need to keep supporting.
The British Grand Prix is always sensational, Shov. Thank you yet again for helping me review another Formula One race.
Thank you very much.
You talk about it being Lewis's home race. We've got a question in from Glenn on Twitter asking just how motivated Lewis is as home fan. Do you find that he comes to a different mindset?
It's difficult to really... Sorry, your voice there for me was massively distorted.
Hallelujah. Okay.
Right, that's better, but it just put me off. It was so roboty.